Plato propounded mystical intellectualia. Aristotle propounded logical intellectualia. The latter erred in saying they too were lying in the senses, for the concept of a cause never lay in the sensual viewing. Immanuel Kant. In the previous lecture, I talked about how the intellect to Kant is the faculty of rules or the faculty of concepts. Concepts being basically thoughts, being general representations by which and through which we understand things, because our viewing, our intuition only gives us singular representations that as such are blind. We see something, we hear something, we feel something, but we don't know what we are seeing or hearing or so on. While in a concept which includes general attributes, once again, it is a rule that applies to many things, to all the things that fall under that concept. Through a concept, I understand things. And this, through concepts, is how I make experience. I need to connect several perceptions, which as perceptions are purely sensual. I need to connect them, to synthesize them with the intellect. I need to make sense of them by understanding them through concepts. Now, one thing I left out so far, one thing I didn't yet talk about is how do we even get to these concepts? How does the intellect get to its concepts? Are they just there? Well, of course not. Of course, we are not just born with all the concepts. We are not born knowing what trees or dogs or the sun are or whatever. We need to get there somehow. Most of our concepts, Kant says, are empirical concepts, like the ones I just named. The concept of trees, of dogs, of houses, whatever. Meaning they are concepts that we arrive at empirically, we arrive at through experience. And it is with these empirical concepts I want to start. There are also other concepts, according to Kant. They are pure intellectual concepts, and I will get there. But understanding how we get to empirical concepts helps understanding how we get to the purely intellectual ones. Now, the process of how we get to empirical concepts, Kant doesn't really talk about that much in his published works. He does a bit in his lectures, like his lectures on logic, and what he says is that we, often in early childhood already, we may have various representations. So let's take the concept of a tree. I see various trees, different trees. I may see oak trees and palm trees and apple trees and whatever. And I need to hold these representations together. I need to compare them with one another. And I need to find what is different between them. Like, different sorts of trees will look different. They will be taller or smaller. Their bark will be more dark, or maybe it will be more light. They will have differently shaped leaves. But then in comparing them, I will also find what they have in common. Like, they probably all have roots, they all have a sort of trunk, they all have leaves. And then I will abstract from what is different. I will put that aside, and I will come to take what they have in common as a grounds for cognition, as general attributes through which I can have cognition of these things. And that is how I arrive at the concept of a tree. Now, here I tried to explain this process in general words and without using any specific terminology. Kant usually does describe it in terminology, but the thing is he's not consistent here. So Kant will describe this process of getting to an empirical concept as a process of several steps, and he will name the steps, for example, the comparison, the reflection, and the abstraction. But then if you look at different passages in Kant, like for example different lectures he gave, you will find that he uses this terminology to mean different things. Like at one point he may say that the comparison is about finding what is different in the various representations. So what is different between seeing an oak tree and seeing an apple tree. And reflection is about finding what is common in them. And then abstraction would mean to abstract from what is different, so what is common is left. But then you may read in another passage that the comparison is about finding what is different and what is common both. And the reflection is not specifically about finding what is common, but rather finding what is common to be a basis for having cognition of these various representations. And then at other points yet, you may have a different terminology. At other points, Kant may not speak of the reflection, but rather of the attention, having attention towards what is common between various representations. Or Kant will talk about the separation, so separating the common elements from what is different between this between the various representations. So you can't really find a consistent terminology there, and that's why I tried describing the whole process in general terms. And also, I mean, even if there was a consistent terminology, I mean, it's not of much use to us today. It is always better when it comes to philosophy to grasp the spirit, to grasp the actual meaning, instead of sticking to the dead letter. That's one reason why, for example, Fichte refused to have a terminology at all, why in his various lectures and books on the Wissenschaftslehre, the doctrine of science, he always has more or less the same content, the same spirit, but in completely different words, naming the same things, completely different thing, because he wanted people to think and to get to the core of the matter and not to just stick to certain terms. And anyways, when it comes to this process of arriving at empirical concepts, Kant seems to not have reflected on that very much as a philosopher, and he seems to not really have to say anything new or groundbreaking in comparison to those who came before him. What Kant is saying here is basically what others, what the Leibniz-Wolfin school in the 18th century would also have said. It is basically what was the common opinion of logicians back then. And I mean, that's probably the very reason you don't really read about it in Kant's published works and only in his lectures on logic, for example. Because, well, his works, his published works, he published to bring science forward, to establish and prove new thoughts. And in his published works, he was talking to basically the experts, the already trained philosophers of his day. So he didn't have to tell them the basics, right? Just like he didn't have to explain the alphabet to them, like to a child just entering school, but could assume that they already can read the alphabet. While on the other hand, his lectures are directed at students who maybe like 16-year-old. University often started earlier back then than today. There he needs to explain this process. But anyways, instead of sticking to a specific terminology, it's better, I think, to just understand what the process is about. And it is about holding different representations together, comparing them, finding differences, but also finding common elements, and reflecting on those common elements and separating them from the rest to arrive at a general concept. I can also talk about the faculties of our mind, which do this, which play a role here. Kant says that finding common elements between various representations is what the wit does. So that is what being witty means, to look at things that on the surface may not have so much in common, but being able to find some commonality between them nonetheless. That's what the wit does. As an aside there, German, being a Germanic language like English, having the same origin, also has this word. In German it's called Witz, but I mean, it's basically the same word as wit if you go to the root. And that's exactly the word Kant uses here. He says it's the wits which finds these commonalities. But the thing is, language evolve and change. And one thing that happened with German is that since the days of Kant, the meaning of the word witz has shifted. And in today's German, it's not really used in the sense of wit anymore, but rather it's meant to mean joke. And this may seem strange at first, but in fact, Kant would say that jokes, they are witty. And again, German here had a change of meaning since Kant's time. In Kant's time, the word witzig meant more or less the same as the English witty. But nowadays, when you say witzig in German, it means funny. But the thing is, Kant actually would say that jokes and puns and so on, they do need wit. The person who comes up with a joke is a witty person, because jokes, Kant would say, are based on finding something common between two things that usually are not taken to have anything in common. And this commonality then surprises us, and that surprise is what leads to us laughing. So as an example, let's take a simple pun. Even when you have a basic and not that witty pun, like reading during sunbathing makes you well wet, the thing is, Kant would say that here the person coming up with such a pun is witty, or you could also say ingenious, because the German word witz is translated by Kant into Latin as ingenium. Witty or ingenious in the sense of finding this commonality between being well read, having read lots of books, and being well read, so your skin turning red from the sun. They, while on the surface having nothing in common, they sound the same. And I know you should never explain a joke, but as a philosopher, when you are not trying to be funny but to be understood, you are allowed to do that. By finding this commonality and pointing it out to people who will usually not find it, will not think about it, not think about how these two different situations or different words may have something in common, that's how you may make people laugh. So that is the wit, finding what is common. And then on the other hand, to find what is different, to distinguish, to tell things apart, that is what requires the power of judgment, Kant would say. Now, this is the term power of judgment used in a more narrow sense. That is not all the power of judgment is. I will talk about this in its own lecture. But here the power of judgment is contrasted to the wit, and while the wit finds what is common, the power of judgment looks at what is different, because that is what it means to have judgment or to be judicious, Kant says, to be able to tell things apart. Maybe some things may seem to have many attributes in common or to even be the same thing. Like you go into the woods and in the forest you find some mushrooms, and they may look like a certain kind of mushroom that you can eat, but in fact they are another type of mushroom that is poisonous. And here you need to be judicious, you need to have power of judgment to not be fooled by their many common attributes, but rather to tell them apart. So this power of judgment in the narrow sense also gets called the power of differentiating by Kant at some point. Now, both of these, the wit and the power of judgment, are important. They simply play different roles. Kant says the wit, if you lack wit, then you are dull. You are not necessarily stupid. Maybe you can still understand things, but you cannot so much come up with new things yourself. While on the other hand, if you lack the power of judgment, then you are stupid. That is what stupidity means to Kant, not being able to differentiate and to tell things apart, not understanding whether a rule applies in a certain case or doesn't apply. Like, let's say you have a real apple and let's say you have a fake apple made from plastic. It requires the power of judgment to tell them apart, and you would be stupid for thinking that the plastic apple is a real apple and for biting into it. It would mean that you applied the wrong rule. the wrong concept. You applied not the concept of a plastic apple, but the concept of a real apple to this thing. And of course, the rule of what a real apple says, it can be eaten. So that was a stupid action. Kant also says that if you lack the power of judgment, while also not being witty or ingenious, then you are just stupid. But if you lack power of judgment, so you can't tell things apart properly, but you are witty or ingenious enough to find commonality, then you are silly or ridiculous, because that is what the ridiculous is to Kant. Finding commonality where there really is none. And basically not being able, or if it's done on purpose, refusing to tell things apart that should be told apart. Like maybe the commonality can be as simple as a rhyme. So when you have a nonsense poem, when you say the cow jumped over the moon and the dish ran away with the spoon, it's complete nonsense. It's silly, and clearly it doesn't really have anything to do with each other, except for the fact that moon and spoon happen to rhyme. So they are taken together because they happen to rhyme. So that is what constitutes silliness or ridiculous things, being witty in a way, finding commonality, while not having enough power of judgment to tell things apart that should be told apart. And Kant would say that the power of judgment ultimately is more important, precisely because you shouldn't be stupid or even ridiculous, because wit alone can, of course, find that things have something in common, and that can be important, that can be the basis for getting new insights, but sometimes it can also lead you astray. Like wit could say, oh, the moon looks like it's made out of cheese, like it's a cheese with many holes, but then it takes power of judgment to realize, okay, the moon and the cheese have something in common. They somewhat look alike, but really, apart from that, they have nothing in common. The moon is not made out of cheese. So Kant would say that the wit leads to new ideas, but the power of judgment is what leads to insights. So because your new idea could also be completely wrong, right? And only by using the power of judgment will you find out whether it's right or wrong. Kant also, in his lectures on anthropology, he likes to talk about national character. That's something you don't really do anymore today. It's probably also not politically correct to do anymore, but in 18th century it was basically a given. And he would often say that the French, they are more witty in their thinking, in their literature, while the English or the British, they have more power of judgment. They are less ingenious but more judicious. So Kant preferred reading English literature or British literature, famously, and I mentioned that in my lecture on dogmatism, skepticism, and criticism. Famously, he was influenced by Hume. Reading Hume is what awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. And Kant would say that the French, literature is might be ingenious, they might have splendid new ideas, but they are often superficial. They don't go deeper and try to really work out those ideas, and they might also go wrong because they are often just seeking bon mots, so witty words that sound good, that you can quote in polite society or in a text, but maybe if you think more about them, it turns out that they actually aren't that deep. While Kant would say the English literature goes deeper and is more thorough in trying to arrive at actual insights. Kant would also say that both of those together, so the wit and the power of judgment, they constitute acumen. So he is not totally consistent with using the words in that way, because sometimes acumen is meant to refer to the combination of both. But sometimes Kant contrasts acumen with wit. So instead of the power of judgment being the name for the faculty which allows us to differentiate, it is the acumen. And in that case, he calls the combination of both the faculty of comparison. But be that as it may, once again, I always think what truly is important is not the terminology, it's not the names you apply, but it's the concepts behind the names. And the concept is that we have one faculty to find commonalities and one faculty to tell things apart. And both play a role in arriving at concepts. Because getting back to the empirical concepts, once again, this is how we get to them. We may see different trees and then we find that they are different in certain ways, but they all have certain things in common. And when we reflect on that, when we abstract from what is different, we arrive at our concept. And this, by the way, this is not just true for concepts of objects like the tree or the dog, the house or so, but of course for all kinds of concepts, including concepts of sensations. Because while a sensation as such is sensual, and I talked about that in my lecture on sensuality and time and space as forms of viewing, but still, even those sensations we have concepts of. Like when I say red, for example, the concept of the color red, I never really see red. Just like I never see a tree, I see an oak tree or an apple tree or a palm tree. I mean, even those I don't really see. I don't see an oak tree. In general, I see that specific oak tree or that other specific oak tree. But anyways, just like I don't see a general tree, I always see specific trees, and to make the judgment this is a tree, to have this general concept, this rule, which we call tree in English, that is a concept of the intellect. Just like that, I never really see red. I see specific shades of red, right? I see dark red or light red, I see blood red, I see crimson, and just like described previously, I can compare these different shades of colors. I can find that there is a difference, like they are darker or they are lighter, but I also find that they have something in common, as opposed to, let's say, blue or green, which is more different. And I reflect on that and I arrive at the general concept of the color red. I may also add that according to Kant, many people have an especially hard time with the last step, that is abstracting from those parts that are, contingent, those parts that don't really belong to the concept. And here I may add to what Kant says, that this is a common problem with unaufkläred people. Being unaufkläred means not leading yourself, but being led. But while many may think it means being led by another person, and therefore maybe wrongly conclude I'm not led by another person, therefore I'm aufklärt, actually, in the majority of cases, it probably means being led by my own sensuality, because unaufkläred people, they're very much, so to say, under the spell of what they happen to sense and what happens to be biggest and loudest, and they have a hard time abstracting from that, and therefore they have a hard time arriving at more abstract concepts and taking out of their concepts what doesn't really belong to them. And that often makes it hard to talk to unaufkläred people and to explain important things to them. Like, for example, I often found when I talk about the fascist tendencies of our society, that I was misunderstood, I was not understood at all, or people found it ridiculous, or like I was overreacting. Because when people hear the word fascism, they think of certain historical instances of fascism. Funnily enough, probably not mainly about the original Italian fascism, which gives the concept its name, but rather about the German Nazis. And so people will say that fascism is an extreme right-wing ideology. They will say that fascism is about the cult of leadership, of the Führer, and they will say that fascism is about racism, about exterminating other people that are deemed subhuman. And the thing is, that is not what fascism is about. Like, none of these elements I named are necessary for something to be fascist. Like the racism, well, that certainly was a very prominent element of the Nazi ideology. But even if we look at Italian fascism, it was not such a prominent thing there, like especially the anti-Semitism. In Italy, Jews could participate and did participate in fascism, and the Nazis pushed Mussolini into persecuting the Jews, but he didn't really want to do that, and he didn't really, for as long as he had some independence from the Nazis. Only later on, when he was much weakened and basically reduced to a puppet, did the Nazis have influence to push for persecution of Italian Jews. And the thing is, what fascism is actually about can be overshadowed by these most prominent instances of fascism, because they are, once again, so to say, so big, so loud, they play such a prominent role in history. It's very easy to only look at them and to treat them like they are the model for what fascism is. In fact, what fascism actually is about is something that was already discovered and described by Nietzsche several decades before it acquired a name through the Italian fascist party and movement. And what Nietzsche described is what the German Nazis later would call Gleichschaltung. So what could be somewhat translated by coordination or equalization, or Nietzsche would probably say turning humans into a herd animal. What fascism is really about is wanting to be everyone the same, wanting to everyone to be equal, wanting to erase all differences. And when you look at the racism of the Nazis, well, that certainly is one possible consequence of that fascism, right? To say everyone should be equal, there should be one Volksgemeinschaft, so one people's community. And the consequence could be to say, well, everyone who's not equal, everyone who's different, needs to go to a concentration camp and be killed off. But actually, that is quite a primitive form of fascism. And no one is to say there can't be more advanced, more sophisticated, more subtle forms of fascism, because in the end, the much more complete fascism, so to say, would not need to kill those who are different, but would be able to transform them, to make them the same, to erase the differences without erasing the people necessarily. And likewise, this cult of the leader. Sure, you could say if everyone is going to belong to one herd, if all people are to become sheeple, then you need one shepherd. But actually, that would mean you have only an incomplete and imperfect version of fascism, because it would mean that you have at least one person who is not the same as everyone else, but who is above everyone else. The perfect fascism would manage to somehow coordinate people and somehow make them all do the same and, so to say, march in the same direction without having anyone marching ahead and telling them where to march. Nietzsche already pointed that out, that the real ideal of slave morality is one herd and no shepherd. But once again, this is often a problem when talking with unaufkläred people, that they are stuck with the sensual, and they are therefore captivated by the surface. And that means that especially the philosopher who goes deeper beyond the surface, who is more radical than anyone else, who thinks in principles, so in general laws that can only be sought, not seen or touched or whatever. That means that especially the philosopher often has a hard time being understood by people. Often the philosopher, who maybe is the most insightful and the most wise of all, in the eyes of the people, may be the most silly, the most ridiculous. Often they may think he's crazy, or they may even get angry at him. This I have found is especially true when it comes to morality, because here the difference is most glaring. The common person has a morality that is based on sensuality. So a morality that basically says don't cause harm, don't cause pain. So when something doesn't cause pain or causes only very, very little pain, more like slight annoyance, he will think it's not really evil, it's not immoral, while the philosopher thinks in principles. So I've had cases, for example, where I was teaching teenagers, like I had my Aufklärungsclasses at schools or whatever, and I had to tell a girl, you can't just spray someone else with your perfume without asking permission first. And the girl would say, "Oh, but it's no big deal. It smells good." So basically saying I did something good for that person. To which I had to explain, well, be that as it may. I mean, first of all, it smells good to you. Maybe it doesn't smell good to the other person. But even if it does smell good to the other person, maybe that person doesn't want to smell good for some reason. Maybe he wants to smell bad. And it should be his decision whether he wants to smell good or not. You can ask him, do you want this? I think it smells good. But you cannot just spray that other person. And I would try to explain that morality is not about not causing pain, because the girl would then say, oh yeah, but it's not so bad, like even if he doesn't want it, it's not really harmful, it's just a bit of smell that will soon go away again. I had to explain morality is not about not causing pain, it is about having regard, having reverence for someone's freedom, for someone's autonomy. I had to say, when you murder someone or when you rape someone, the issue is not that you cause pain. That is purely accidental. You can do it when a person is asleep or drugged. So you can murder or you can rape without causing pain. But the issue rather is that you take away someone's autonomy. Now, for the philosopher, this is absolutely clear. But the school children, the teenagers, they would find it funny or ludicrous, and they would say, "Oh, but now this is exaggerating. You are comparing spraying someone with perfume with rape. It's not the same thing." Why is it not the same thing, though? It is not the same thing to our senses. Of course, to our senses, there's an extreme difference. So extreme that it probably even seems insulting to compare the two. But in principle, and I'm not saying they are equally big crimes. Like, of course, raping someone is a much more terrible crime. But still, the principle behind it, in both cases, is disregard for the other person's autonomy. The principle behind it is I decide what I want to do. I don't ask what the other person wants to do. Or likewise, I had to tell someone who thought himself to be a very good host, who on a hot summer day asked his guest if he wanted a glass of water, and the guest said yes. Who then walked a glass of water with ice cubes in it without having asked. I had to tell him that that is disregard. Now, he may think of himself as a great host, giving his guest ice to cool down on this hot day. But once again, that would be the guest's decision. Whether he wants ice. He probably doesn't like it. Like, I don't like when it's hot, I don't need the shock of something extra cold. like this big temperature difference. It's terrible for me, and in the end it only makes you hotter. Like it cools you for a short moment, but then it causes the opposite reaction from your body. I would much rather wash myself with a cloth with hot water. That really has a cooling effect. But that aside, even if the person did like it, maybe he doesn't want something he likes right now. It's his decision. And you would have been a good host if you asked, if you had said, hey, do you also want ice in your water? I can give you ice too. But just doing it, that is basically thinking for the other person, taking the other person's autonomy away. And Kant says, I will address that more when I get to Kant's political philosophy eventually. Kant says that despotism is not just when some tyrant tortures his subjects somehow, but also when he tries to force them to become happy according to his concepts of happiness. He should let them be free to pursue their own happiness, but he should not try to force them to be happy. We have seen in the past, like for example with the communist regimes, what that can lead to when the rulers think they know what is best for the people and what will lead to the people's happiness. And once again, I was not understood. Like the guy took it to be a joke. He would joke about it at later points, saying, "Oh, I learned from you that putting ice cubes in someone's glass is that is the pure evil." And that is exactly because unaufkläred people are so captivated by their sensuality. And as Kant says, they have a very hard time, like it's near impossible for most of them, to ever abstract from sensuality. And of course, sensually, it's very, very different and causing much, much, much less pain to spray someone with perfume or to put ice in someone's water without having asked than it is to rape someone or to be a despot. But if you abstract from the sensual and if you just look at the principle behind it, the principle of disregarding someone's autonomy, you will find that all these actions are immoral, all these actions are evil. But let's get back to Kant's remarks about the intellect. He says that out of the three faculties of thinking, I talked about that already in my lecture on apperception, that our higher faculty of cognition or our thinking faculty has three parts: the intellect, the power of judgment, and reason. And out of these three, Kant says it is the intellect which develops first. Like even in early childhood, we start forming concepts, we start understanding what things are. Surely at first basic, more sensual things like trees or animals or whatever. But still the intellect develops first. And you can have a good, correct intellect, even if it is not a big intellect, Kant says. So you don't necessarily need to have many concepts in your intellect, as long as you have correct concepts. And Kant would often say that simple people like peasants, they often don't have that many concepts. Like a peasant in Kant's time, what would he know about faraway countries and the customs or the animals in those countries? Or what would he know about scientific discoveries like chemical discoveries? What would he know of astronomy, how the planets work and their movements? But in his area, in his everyday life, he has correct concepts. Like he knows about the animals he tends to, he knows about the crops he uses, and concepts, once again, they are rules. He probably has the correct rules. He knows when to plant which crops, he knows when to harvest them, and so on. And on the other hand, a scholar, a scientist may have a more extended intellect. He may have much more concepts the more he learned, but he also may have more incorrect concepts. Kant would often say that a village full of peasants contains less errors than an academy of science. And this is not some anti intellectualism, this is not Kant saying that common sense, this basically, if you listen to some people, apparently magical tool by which you just magically know the truth without having done any research. He's not saying that common sense is better than science, not at all. He's just saying that the less things you think about, the less likely you are to go wrong, right? If you try to think about more things, to have more insights, to explain the world more, there's also a higher chance of going wrong. And what is important to Kant is, not going beyond your horizon with your concepts. Like you can, of course, broaden your horizon, and then you can also have more concepts. But as long as your horizon is what it is, you may not go beyond it. Like you should have enough self-reflection to know what you know and what you don't know, and issues only arise, so to say, when the peasant tries to think about how the planets move or what people in China may be doing, when in fact he has no data, no experience to base his opinions on. That is probably the big issue of our time. We barely have those simple people anymore that Kant talks about. Like there are no peasants as such anymore. If you are a farmer today, you still have internet and you can still leave comments in the online. And the thing is that you now have a lot of clueless or uneducated people still having opinions about things that are beyond their horizon. Kant also says that the intellect is not just the faculty of rules, the intellect is not just the ability to come up with rules or to find rules in the world, but also the intellect wants to find rules. Like we have sort of a natural drive to try and understand the world. We are not content living in a, so to say, in an ununderstood chaos, but rather we want to make sense of that chaos by finding rules. And this is often a good thing, Kant says. I mean, this drive of ours, this curiosity to find rules wherever we look, this often makes us find rules and understand the world better. And this is at the basis of science as an endeavor. But Kant is aware that this natural drive of our intellect to find rules wherever we go, this can also lead to superstitions. This can lead to, nowadays we would say, and Kant would talk about superstitions and such, but nowadays we can also say this leads to conspiracy theories. Because once again, the intellect always wants to find rules, and not always there are rules. Like sometimes things just happen by chance. Some things are coincidences. For example, I know someone who, within a short time, like about 2 months or so, suddenly lost her mother and her grandmother. They both fell ill, died of cancer, and someone she knows got worried about that and said, "Oh, there must be a curse on your family, and now you need to sacrifice a black chicken to lift that curse, so no one else dies." So here, we find a sort of lawless manifold, to say it in Kant's words. We find a sort of chaos in the world. We find two people in a family dying within a short time frame. Sometimes stuff just happens, but the intellect is not content with that, so the intellect tries to find a rule, find a cause why this happened, and then the intellect becomes superstitious and says, "Oh, there must be a curse causing people in this family to die." And the same, as I said, is what conspiracy theorists often work with. Like, they may note that, oh, the 11th of September 2001, if you add all these numbers, if you add 11 to 9 to 2 to 1, then you get 23, and 23 is the number of the Illuminati. So clearly they are behind the 9/11. Now, no one really knows why the Illuminati are smart enough to control the whole world and all the governments and media and fool all the people, apart from some apparently very smart conspiracy theorists on TikTok, but still feel the need to sort of leave their signature by doing their big conspiracy, enacting their big plan on a certain date that basically betrays who's behind it. No one knows why they would do that. But anyways, the point here is that the intellect tries to find a rule, like finding the number 23. And when you try to find a rule, you can always find a rule. Not necessarily a true rule, but you can always find, or you can always make up rules that seem to be in place. I mean, the same happens with the number 666, right? This diabolical number people take from the Bible, from the book of Revelation. And I mean, it's not a secret what the number means. The number means the Emperor Neron. Like, ask any Bible scholar, and he will tell you it's Emperor Neron. There's no question about it. But still, people make up all sorts of interpretations, and they will look at names of people, like of presidents or popes or famous people or whoever, and do some mathematical tricks and shifts, and thereby prove that that person's name, if you take the value of the letter in the alphabet, and if you add the letters and divide them by themselves or whatever, then you arrive at 666. So you can find rules anywhere, and this, of course, can even lead to complete craziness. Like, as Freud would later point out, the mentally sane person and the insane person, they are not necessarily different in quality, like completely different, but more so they are different in degree. So the insane person may just be someone who finds rules or who imagines rules that simply are not there, like someone who is paranoid or schizophrenic, thinking that there is some conspiracy going on around him, that people are out to get him, and seeing signs where there are none. And Kant also points out that one issue is that if people lack in intellect, they can't realize, because realizing that would itself require intellect. Like if the intellect is the faculty of rules of concepts, and you don't have many, or you don't have correct rules or concepts, how would you know without conceptualizing that? And people also don't want to admit that they lack an intellect. They feel insulted by it. Like Kant says that other abilities, even other intellectual abilities, other faculties of the mind, we may admit to not having. Like someone may admit to not being very witty, to not being ingenious, to not coming up with many new ideas, to not finding commonalities so easily. But he may not admit, he may rather be offended if you claim that to be the case. He may not admit to not being able to understand things at all, and to not grasping common rules at all when they are given to him. But now let's remember what the critique of pure reason is about, what Kant actually cares for. I made a lecture about that actually already. The critique of pure reason, the project of the critique, is about the question: how are synthetic, or more precisely in the case of the critique of pure reason, how are synthetic logical judgments a priori possible? And judgments require concepts. Actually, Kant defines concepts at some points as being predicates to possible judgments. Remember, this is also something I talked about in previous lectures. In logic, a judgment would be described as containing a subject, so something about which you are making a statement, something which the judgment is about, and containing a predicate, which is, well, predicated of that subject and connected to that subject by a copula. Usually the word is. So if I make the judgment Kant is a philosopher, then Kant is the subject. I'm making a statement about Kant. And philosopher is the predicate. And philosopher, of course, is a concept. It contains certain rules. I made lectures already about what is philosophy to Kant. He would say the philosopher, according to the school concept, is mainly the metaphysician who deals with God, freedom, and immortality. According to the world concept, he is the wise lawgiver of reason who says where we should go, what our vocation is as humans, what our real end should be. And these general rules contained in the concept philosopher, by my judgment, I'm basically stating that they apply to the subject Immanuel Kant. Now, if concepts in general are predicates to possible judgments, and now we are asking how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, then it should be clear that they are not possible through empirical concepts. An empirical concept is a concept I arrived at through experience. So I arrived at it a posteriori. And that means they are good for making synthetic judgments a posteriori, making judgments, well, that expand my knowledge a posteriori. So basically, experience. They are good for making experience. But it should be clear that if I want to make a synthetic judgment a priori, if I want to expand my knowledge a priori, I need, well, concepts that are not empirical. And such concepts Kant calls pure concepts of the intellect. As always, pure, when Kant uses that word, means not empirical. That in the end basically means not containing any sensations, not based on sensations, on sense impressions. So there are, and Kant says, or there must be, if there are to be synthetic judgments a priori, there must be pure concepts of the intellect. And such concepts, to also better distinguish them from the regular empirical concepts, Kant calls notions. So this is, of course, another use of the word as you use it in modern everyday English, but to Kant, a notion is a subgroup of concept, and it's a kind of concept that is not empirical. And it should be obvious that non-empirical concepts are a thing. Like, even if you look at something like mathematics, it contains concepts that are not empirical. Take geometry, take the concept of a triangle or of a circle. It is a concept, meaning it is a general representation containing some general rules, some general attributes that apply to various things. So the concept of a triangle contains the rule of having three sides, three straight lines, and that rule applies to every object that, well, falls under that concept, that is a triangle. And of course, in mathematics, Kant would say, and this is something I discussed in previous lectures, in mathematics, our concepts are not empirical, but they are still sensual, because they are still based on our forms of viewing, that is space and or time, which are sensual forms of viewing, because we don't have an intellectual viewing like God may have. We only view things in sensuality. And that is what mathematics does, according to Kant. It comes up with concepts arbitrarily, like it starts from axioms. It starts out saying, well, I now want to think of an object with three straight lines and three angles, and I will henceforth call it a triangle. And then this general concept is constructed in viewing, in intuition. So in the case of geometry in space, this construction doesn't need to happen empirically, so I don't necessarily need to draw the triangle. It can also happen just in my mind. But I do need, Kant says, I do need to construct that triangle in space. And then in this concrete case, having constructed a concrete triangle, I can find certain facts, certain truths. I can have cognition. which applies to the concept in general, so which applies to all triangles. Well, this is what mathematics does. So it has non-empirical but still sensual concepts. But there are also, Kant would say, concepts that are not sensual at all. One such concept is the concept of causality. Now, of course, Locke, as an empiricist, had believed causality to be empirical. He had said that we find causal relations in the world, we find cause and effect, and thereby eventually throughout our lives get to a point where we have this general concept of causality. But here Hume, as a skepticist, had refuted Locke and had shown that no, we don't find causality in experience. When I see one billiard ball walling against the second one and then the second one walling away, I don't see the second one starting to wall away because of the first one. I can't see a because. I can only see, I have the perception of the first ball walling against the second one, and then the perception of the second one walling away. But causality I don't find here. It's not something I view, something I can see or feel or whatever. And this is exactly what awoke Kant from his dogmatic slumber. And he would agree with Hume in saying that causality is not something we take out of experience. But he would also go beyond Hume, because Hume was still empiricist like Locke in the way that he believed all our knowledge needs to come from experience. So therefore, since he recognized that our knowledge of causality doesn't come from experience, he arrived at the skeptical conclusion that we have no knowledge of causality at all. This is where Kant would disagree and go beyond Hume. He would say that we do have knowledge of causality. It is a correct notion that there is a causal relationship, but causality is not an empirical concept. It is a notion. It is a pure intellectual concept. It is something that is in our intellect and not in our experience. And in fact, Kant would find that not only do we not learn of causality existing from experience, but rather it is the opposite. We can only make experience because we already have a concept of causality. So if I touch the hot stove and I burn myself, I talked about such things in the last lecture on experience and concepts. That is not an experience. Those are two perceptions. I touched the stove and I got burnt. And I could repeat that 100 times without ever making the judgment that I got burnt because of the stove, that I got burnt because the stove is hot. That is not something I can feel, this because. It is something I have to judge. And how would I ever make that judgment if I didn't already have the notion of a because? So, of a cause causing an effect in me, so to say. So, that is exactly what transcendental philosophy is about. And I already made a lecture on transcendental philosophy, or rather on transcendental idealism too. Kant would say that causality, along with 11 other pure intellectual concepts, I will talk about them in more detail in the next lecture. Kant would say that causality is a condition of the possibility of experience. We don't learn of causality from experience. Rather, we need to have a notion of causality in order to be able to make experiences. And if we didn't have this causal thinking, then we could never connect perceptions in our mind as being a cause and effect, and therefore we could never make an experience. That is exactly Kant's transcendental insight. In all our experience, such notions are at play. In my lecture on sensuality and on time and space as forms of viewing, I gave the example of a rose or a piece of sugar, and you may think of those once more. And back then, I said, well, at first, they give us certain sensations, right? We see red or green in the rose, we see white or brown in the sugar. We smell the rose, we taste the sweetness of the sugar, and I asked what remains if we abstract from those sensations. So what else are these objects besides the sensations they give us? And in that lecture I said what remains are time and space as our forms of viewing. As the forms within all sensations appear to us. So the rose or the sugar, they inhabit a certain place in space, and they have a certain shape. No matter whether the object shaped as such is red or green or white or whatever, but it does have a certain place and shape in space. And likewise, I said they inhabit a certain point in time, and the sensations they give us have a certain duration in time. It doesn't matter if I smell a rose smell or the smell of a lily. It doesn't matter if I taste sweetness or saltiness, but those sensations happen during a certain time. Now that is still sensual, however. Those are the forms of our sensual viewing. What happens if we abstract not just from the sensations, from the red, green, white, smell, sweetness, but also from time and space? What then remains of the rose and of the sugar? What remains cannot be something sensual. It can only be something intellectual. It can only be concepts. And what concepts remain? Well, for example, the concept of being an object at all, and as an object having certain attributes. In the language of philosophy, in the proper terminology, that would be the concept of substance and accidents. Now, no matter whether the object is a rose and the attribute it has is being red, or whether the object is a pumpkin and the attribute is being orange, what matters is I think of it as an object containing certain attributes. Likewise, I have the concept of that object having a certain force, so to say, and affecting me through that force, causing me to have certain sensations. Once again, no matter what sensations that may be, but I have this concept. I think of the object forcing me to have these sensations. Or I may think of them, the rose and the sugar, as being a whole made up of several parts. Like the rose has several leaves, and the leaves have cells again, and the cells are made up of molecules, and those are made up of atoms. I always think of this object as being a whole of several parts, and so on. So there are certain concepts that remain even if I abstract from everything sensual. And those concepts must be pure intellectual concepts. They must be notions, meaning they must be concepts I haven't taken from experience, because, once again, they remain if I take all empirical away from the object. And they are necessary as conditions of the possibility of experience. If I didn't have these concepts, if I wouldn't think of things as being objects with attributes, as being wholes made up of parts, then I could not experience these things at all. And if you go back to my lecture on what is metaphysics to Kant, I talked about the various parts, about the various subfields of metaphysics, and I said that one is ontology, a field that Kant didn't come up with, that existed in philosophy long before Kant. Ontology, if you translate it from the Greek correctly, would be something like the doctrine of being. Kant prefers translating it by the doctrine of essence. The thing is that unlike other fields of metaphysics, ontology doesn't deal with a specific object and trying to understand that specific object's nature. Like, for example, rational theology will deal with God, trying to understand what God is, if there is even a God. Or like rational psychology will try to understand what is the soul, is there an immortal soul, and so on. Ontology doesn't deal with a specific object, but rather it deals with objects as such. It deals with what even is an object, what does it mean to be, to exist, and what is the essence, or what are the attributes of all objects, no matter what they may be as individual specific objects, no matter their differences that make them this or that object, but just being something as such, as opposed to being nothing. What does that contain? And to Kant, ontology would basically be the science of the notions, of the pure intellectual concepts. Ontology would be concerned with finding them, giving, so to say, a complete list, a complete catalog of all our notions, which according to Kant is possible. Like, ontology is a science that can be completed, because, of course, empirical concepts, we can never have all empirical concepts that we could have. Like, we can always form new empirical concepts. We can always find new things. There are probably some new animals, some bugs or worms that have not yet discovered and that we therefore have no concepts of. There are maybe new molecules to be discovered, new connections of atoms. There are maybe new planets out there that we have not discovered yet and therefore have no concept of yet. Or we may invent new things, new technologies. and so on. So empirical concepts are potentially endless. We can always get new empirical concepts. But the pure intellectual concepts, which come out of our intellect, there must be a limited number of them, Kant says. And so therefore it would be possible for an ontology to find them all. And then the task of ontology would be to find out what these concepts mean. And that, of course, is an analytic task that doesn't require synthetic judgments, not synthetic judgments a priori either, because synthesis means combining concepts and thereby extending our knowledge. But rather, this would be about explaining our pure intellectual concepts to ourselves by analyzing them, by asking, what does it mean to be a whole or a part? What does causality mean? By reflecting on what do we think when we think of this concept? What rules does it contain, and what rules doesn't it contain? So, for example, saying causality means that if one thing A is the case, then simply by A being the case, another thing B must also be a case. That is what it means to say that A is the cause of B and B is the effect of A. So that would be what ontology is about: finding and then analyzing and defining our pure intellectual concepts. And since all our thinking happens in these concepts, like they are basically the basic elements of our thinking, and the finding them all and defining them all would be like having the table of the elements in chemistry. That is why ontology is sort of the basic science that would be needed by all other sciences, be they empirical sciences, be they natural science, which is dealing with empirical objects like certain animals or chemical elements or the planets, or be they metaphysical sciences, which deal with metaphysical objects like God or like the soul. They all would profit from a proper ontology, bringing them clarity about the concepts they are using and the concepts they are thinking with. They all would profit from having a proper understanding of what it is they mean when they say something, be it an empirical object or be it God, is a substance, is a thing containing certain accidents, certain attributes. Whether I'm saying God is almighty or all-knowing, or whether I'm saying the rose is red, I'm always saying this thing is something. It has a certain attribute. Or they all would profit from knowing what they mean by causality. Whether I talk about God being the cause and the world being the effect, or whether I'm talking about something in the world being a cause for something else, like be the fire burning in the oven being the cause of the room being hot. But also here it can probably become more clear why Kant prefers to talk not of ontology but of transcendental philosophy. I addressed this in my lecture on what is transcendental idealism. I said that even before Kant, the name transcendental philosophy was sometimes used as a synonym for ontology. And Kant still uses it as more or less a synonym, but he prefers this name to the name ontology. And that is because of the shift in understanding that comes with his critical turn, with his Copernican turn on philosophy. Because ontology, classical ontology, since antiquity and until the 18th century, until Kant came along, had believed ontology to be really a doctrine of being. So a doctrine of how the things, taken as things in themselves, how they are constituted, what are the basic attributes of things, being a substance with accidents, having causality, being a whole or a part, being something that is possible or that exists or that is necessary. Those were taken to be elements of actual things existing outside of us. And what Kant understands, however, is that these pure intellectual notions are not the basic elements of the things. They are the basic elements of our thinking. Like, we have to think in these notions. We can't help it. We can't think in any other way but in these notions. And that means that, of course, these notions are the basic elements of all the things that we deal with, of all the things that appear to us, because those things, by appearing to us, are within us. They are our representations. And since we can't think of anything in any other way but through our pure intellectual concepts, through our basic elements of thinking, that means that all the things that appear to us must indeed conform to these basic elements, must be, so to say, made up of these basic elements. But we cannot claim that our thinking, the elements that constitute our thinking, that this holds any truth when it comes to the things in themselves. So we can say that all things that we experience must follow these notions. And we can even say that things that we don't experience, like God, if we try to think of such things, we necessarily will think of them through those notions. So I necessarily will think of God as a substance with accidents. I will think of God as being a necessary being. I will think of God as being the uncaused cause of everything else. But that doesn't really tell me anything about God. That tells me more about myself and how I need to think and can't help but thinking that way. But Kant's whole point is that it would be an error to think I have really learned something about God here, that I have really understood God here. That is what transcendental philosophy is about, realizing that ontology is not really the doctrine of being, but the doctrine of our thinking, and therefore of the being of all the things that we think, of all the things that appear to us, but not of the things in themselves. Now, Kant says there are, in a way, 4 ways to do philosophy. You can, and I talked about 3 of those already in my lecture on dogmatism, skepticism, and criticism, because Kant says you can either look at the object or you can look at the subject. If you look at the object of cognition, so you try to find knowledge about the objects in the world, including yourself, if you take yourself as an object, as you do in psychology. If you try to find knowledge about the objects, Kant says, you can do so dogmatically. Dogmatism being the belief that we can have knowledge about the object. Or you can do so skeptically. Skepticism being the belief that we can't have knowledge of the objects. Now, the other possibility, Kant would say, is to look at the subject of cognition. So, not trying to learn anything about the objects, but learn something about the subject who thinks of those objects. And when doing so, there again are two possibilities. You can either look at the subject critically or physiologically. Now, the critique of reason, and that is, of course, what Kant is doing. That is Kant's great project in his three main works. And this means examining the source of our a priori judgments, of our synthetic judgments a priori, and thereby examining the scope and the limits of such judgments. So the critique would ask not so much where do our intellectual concepts come from. The critique as such can just accept that we have these intellectual concepts, and now it asks what can we do with them? In what ways are we justified using them? And again, a concept is a predicate to a possible judgment. So in what ways and in how far are we justified to use these pure intellectual concepts we have to make synthetic judgments a priori, and where aren't we justified to use these concepts for synthetic judgments a priori? And of course, the answer of the critique, which I already addressed in previous lectures and will address again in coming lectures, the answer is that making synthetic judgments, so judgments that don't just explain a concept like the analytic judgments do, but rather that combine it with other concepts and thereby extend our knowledge, judgments through which we learn something new. Making a synthetic judgment always requires viewing, intuition. That is the third element in which and through which we can combine our concepts. So a synthetic judgment a posteriori, that is a judgment of experience, of course needs empirical viewing. We need to actually experience something. For example, we need to see a black raven so that we can combine the concept of blackness and the concept of raven and make the judgment ravens are black. But synthetic judgments a priori, while they can't be based on empirical viewing, because that would not be a priori, that would be a posteriori, they are still based on viewing, just on pure viewing, the pure viewing of time or space. And therefore, since all our viewing is sensual, we don't have an intellectual viewing like God, That means that our synthetic judgments a priori can only be applied to sensuality, so to experience. We can make certain a priori statements and predictions about experience, and we cannot, on the other hand, go beyond experience with our judgments. We can go beyond experience with our thinking, like we can think about God, but that is empty then. Here we again get to that famous statement of Kant's that while viewing without concepts is blind, I don't know what I'm viewing if I'm not understanding it through concepts. Thoughts, that is concepts, without viewing, without content, they are empty. They are empty thoughts that don't really mean anything. Remember what I said in the last lecture. Cognition is, according to Kant, an objective representation. Cognition is a representation that gets related to an object outside of representation. And I can only do that if I view that object. If I have no viewing of the object, like in the case of God, my representation, my thought of God, remains subjective, and I can't know if whatever I think about God is true or is just empty thoughts, because I don't know if it relates to an object outside of my thoughts. That is the great insight of the critique of pure reason. And from that follows that metaphysics can be immanent. I talk about the difference of immanence and transcendence in my lecture on what is metaphysics. Metaphysics can be done if it is immanent. So I can use pure reason to make synthetic judgments a priori, independently of experience, but about things which I can experience, like I can do a metaphysics of nature, which makes certain a priori judgments about the nature of matter, but matter, of course, being something I know from experience. But metaphysics cannot be transcendent. I cannot make synthetic judgments a priori about objects that I have no experience of at all, and that therefore I don't even know to exist. Once again, objects like God. So that is what the critical inquiry into the subject means. Asking in how much is the subject justified to use its notions, to use its pure intellectual concepts, and what are the limits of doing so. And the answer is we can use them if we apply them to sensuality, but we cannot use them independently of our sensuality. But then Kant says there's also a second possible inquiry you can make into the subject, and that is not the critique of reason, but rather the physiology of reason. Now you need to be careful here, because the word physiology by Kant often is also used as a synonym for natural science. But here this has nothing to do with natural science. Rather, the question of physiology is, where do we get our concepts from? Or rather, the pure intellectual concepts, where do we get from? That is, once again, not a question that concerns the critique of reason as such. The critique only asks, are we justified in using these concepts, and where are the limits of their usage? While the physiology asks, where do we even get them from? And Kant says that it was John Locke who can be credited with starting this line of inquiry. So this is not Kant's main concern. It's not his real question where these concepts come from. And he also says this is not so much a matter concerning metaphysics, but rather here you go into psychology. And therefore, Kant hasn't written that much about it. But still, he has written some things about it, and he has given an answer to where these pure intellectual concepts come from. And I want to talk about that for a bit. When it comes to this question of the physiology of reason, then there are generally two parties in the history of philosophy, the parties of the empiricists and of the rationalists. And as always, I talked about this in previous lectures, especially in the one on Kant's sympathetic method. As always, Kant believes when there are two opposing opinions that have both been held for a long time, for many centuries, and that have both been held by very insightful people, then you shouldn't just go over to one side or the other and try to completely refute the other side, but rather you should assume that both have a point. There's some truth in both of them, and you should try to find and to keep that partial truth and to combine them into a third answer. And as always, when faced with this opposition between empiricism and rationalism, we already saw an example of that in my lecture on sensuality and time and space as forms of viewing, when it came to the different opinions about time and space that Newton or Leibniz held. As always, when it comes to the opposition between these two parties, Kant is a rationalist, but he is a subjective or critical rationalist. So what are the specific opinions about this physiology of reason, and what is Kant's solution? Well, first we have the empiricists. In antiquity, Kant would identify people like Aristotle or Epicure as empiricists. And in his own age of Aufklärung, I already mentioned Locke as the most prominent example of an empiricist. And the empiricists will claim, when the question is asked, where do the intellectual concepts, the pure intellectual concepts, come from? It's important to say pure intellectual concepts because, of course, all the concepts, including the empirical ones, are intellectual in the sense that the intellect is the faculty of concepts. The intellect is exactly the faculty that thinks concepts. And insofar as a concept is a form, it is intellectual, because only the sensuality gives us only matter, only content, that as such has no form. It is just formless, lawless chaos. And it is exactly the intellect which orders it, which gives it a form. And what constitutes the form of all concepts is their generality. A concept is a general rule, or a set of general rules. And when it comes to the form, when it comes to this form of generality, then all concepts are intellectual and originating in the intellect. But the thing is that the content of the concept is originating from the senses when we are talking about empirical concepts. Like when I talk about the concept of a tree, I'm saying that there are certain rules, like having roots, having a trunk, having leaves, needing sunlight, needing water, that may apply to all trees. But the specific content of these general rules, so what I just named, that trees have leaves and that trees have roots, that they need water and so on, this content I get empirically. Now, when it comes to the pure intellectual concepts, here it's not just their form that is intellectual, but rather it is their content too. So, anyways, if the question is how, or rather, where do these pure intellectual concepts originate, where does their content come from, then the empiricists say it comes from experience. So basically, the empiricists deny that there are pure intellectual concepts. They basically say all our concepts are empirical concepts. Their content always comes from the senses. You could characterize empiricism by the motto, the famous motto, nothing is in the intellect that wasn't previously in the senses. Or as Locke famously says, the human being is a tabula rasa. So he comes into the world, he is born, and he's just a blank slate. There's nothing, no concepts. And it is life, it is experience, which, so to say, writes down things on that blank slate over time. But there are quite obvious problems with this empiricism. Now, first of all, it's just obviously not true. And that is what Hume showed when it came to the concept of causality. But Kant also extended that onto other pure intellectual concepts. Like there are simply certain concepts that we apply to experience, and we can only make experience by using these concepts, like causality, but we obviously don't take them from experience. Precisely because we can only make experience through them, so we already need to have them in a sense. But that's not even the only problem. There's also the problem that if we accepted that such a concept like causality comes from experience, that would lead directly to skepticism, because experience, I talked about that in my lecture on what is philosophy to Kant, experience gives us no universality. We can only find individual cases, and then we can use induction or analogy to generalize that, but we can never find true necessity and universality. I can see 1,000 white swans. That doesn't mean I can ever be sure that there aren't any black swans. Only what I arrive at a priori through reason alone and not through experience can be universal and necessary. So empiricism would have to lead to skepticism, just like Locke led to Hume. If I get causality from experience, then I cannot be sure that I will always experience causality. I can never be sure if maybe it is possible for something to happen without a cause, just because it happens to happen. And also, what Kant criticizes about not necessarily empirism as such, but many empiricists like Locke or like Aristotle, is that they claim to take their concepts from experience, but then they go beyond experience with their concepts. So, for example, they will say that the concept of causality is something we find in experience, but then they will use it to prove that there's a God, saying everything in the world has a cause, therefore there must be an ultimate cause of the world. There must be an unmoved first mover who moved the world. That is something you can't do, Kant says. If you say that you take this concept of causality only from experience, then at most it can be correctly applied to the objects of experience, to sensual object. But you have no justification for taking this concept which you have found in one area and which you have found to work in one area and leave that area with it and apply it to a completely different area. That just doesn't work. That is why Kant says if you must be an empiricist, then the most consistent one is probably Epicure in antiquity, because he wouldn't do metaphysics. He would basically say that we can't know anything about the gods. So even though Kant disagrees with his empiricism, he respects his consistency. Last but not least, the issue of empiricism is that it cannot possibly prove its claim that nothing is in the intellect which wasn't previously in the senses. Because how would you prove that claim? Any proof would either have to be a proof from experience, a proof a posteriori, but since this is a general statement, a universal statement, like empiricism is not just saying most things in the intellect come through the senses, but all the things come through the senses, and this is necessary. It can't be any other way. This is something you can never prove empirically, because once again, universality and necessity you can only get from reason, not from the empirical. So that would mean that the only possible proof for that statement could be an a priori proof, could be a proof coming not through the senses but from the intellect. But it is obvious that if empiricists try to give such a proof, so a rational proof that all our knowledge is not rational but empirical, they would end up contradicting themselves. So really, empiricism is based on a baseless statement that it itself can't prove without self-contradicting. That is exactly the reason why in this physiological question of where do the pure intellectual concepts originate, Kant is a rationalist. Meaning he believes that there are pure intellectual concepts. They originate in the intellect and not in experience. And this rationalism also has been the theory of many philosophers. In antiquity, Kant would see Plato as a sort of rationalist. In his own age of Aufklärung, the most prominent example would be Leibniz, and therefore the whole Leibniz-Wolffian school was rationalist in their outlook. And Leibniz famously replied to Locke when Locke said nothing is in the intellect which wasn't previously in the senses. Leibniz famously replied, accept the intellect itself, thereby disproving Locke by pointing out that surely most things we may take from the senses, but the intellect itself is not something we got through our senses. It is something that must already be there in order for us to even be able to get new concepts through the senses. But the classical rationalism that came before Kant, that he would call dogmatic rationalism, or that you could call objective rationalism, objective in the sense that it believes certain judgments to not just come out of our intellect, of our rationality, but rather certain judgments about the objects, about the objective world. While Kant's subjective rationalism will say that certain judgments come not from the senses, but from intellect or rationality, but they are subjective. They are true not about the things in themselves, but about the things as they appear to us as subjects. Because this classical dogmatic rationalism would say, when asked about the origin of the place of origin of the pure intellectual concepts, that they originate in the intellect. But physiology can also ask not just where do these concepts come from the senses or from the intellect, but also how do we get to them. And here the dogmatic rationalist will probably say that we are sort of born with them. Now there may be different theories of how and why we are born with them. Leibniz is not really clear about that. Plato would claim that our soul had, in Kant's words, an intellectual viewing before our birth, that our soul saw the ideas, the divine ideas, the divine true forms of things, and then it forgets when it's born. But learning during our life is not really so much learning as rather we remembering. Plato would say we are born with these concepts because we once saw them before birth. Now, you could also maybe biologize and evolutionize it, and that has been tried since Kant, saying that through our evolution, our intellect developed in a certain way, and it developed to contain certain concepts even by birth. You could say that God put those concepts into our intellect somehow. You could say that we have some mystical vision and insight that gives us these intellects. But no matter how exactly you explain it, the point is that the claim in the end will be that our intellect just has and probably always has had these concepts. And this, again, is something Kant disagrees with. This, again, is something that comes with several problems. One problem is what is called Schwärmerei, and what Kant is always fighting. You could translate it by enthusiasm. It means that we go beyond our experience with our thinking, that we basically just make things up, claiming to have deeper insights or maybe also mystical visions, claiming to understand the nature of God, or claiming to know what the afterlife looks like. And Kant says, as long as we are empiricists, there is, of course, not such a danger of enthusiasm, of going beyond the empirical. But if we already believe, as the dogmatic rationalist does, that we just can magically have certain concepts, certain thoughts, certain insights without any experience, then there is no limit to it. Nothing is stopping us, even if that one particular rationalist doesn't want that. Nothing is stopping another guy from claiming that he has some more concepts. Like, one person may say, I am born with the concept of causality. The next person may say, well, I'm born knowing what the afterlife looks like. And you can't really refute that if you already accept that you can just magically have certain concepts. Also, this is an issue to Kant because if you say that you are just born with these concepts, you are really saying nothing. You are not explaining anything. And it is what Kant calls lazy philosophy. Because philosophy to Kant should be causal. Philosophy should be, and this applies not just to philosophy in the stricter sense, not just to metaphysics, but it applies also to applied philosophy, so to natural science. Kant says that all philosophy should be about explaining things, giving the cause for things, explaining the why of things. And so whenever philosophy claims that we are just born with something, and that goes for theoretical philosophy when it claims that we are just born having certain concepts in our mind, but this also goes for practical philosophy. That is why Kant is not a fan of the concept of original sin, because if your answer to the question of why are humans evil, or why can humans be evil, why do they always end up doing bad things, if your answer is just, well, they are born that way, they are born as sinners, they are born with this innate evil, then you are not really giving an answer at all. Aside from that, if the answer to why we sin is because of original sin, then that leaves open the question, how was original sin possible? Like, why did Adam and Eve eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and how were they even able to do so against God's commandment, if it was only that eating of the fruit which made people into sinners who are always compelled to turn against God's commandments? But anyways, Kant calls this a lazy philosophy, because you really answer the question by just refusing to giving an answer, by just saying, well, this is how it is, and now we are done. And lastly, maybe most importantly, if you accept that these concepts, that we are born with them, like the concept of causality, no matter whether they are given to us by God, or we got them through evolution, the thing is then that you end up thinking that you deal with the things in themselves. And this necessarily leads to the question, I talked about that already in the lecture on transcendental idealism, leads to the question, how can you be sure that these concepts of yours, that they can be applied to the things in themselves? Like, you just do it, you apply them, but how do you know if you believe to be seeing the things in themselves, that you see them as they really are and not in some distorted way. Like, let's take the concept of causality. If I am born with it, okay, that explains why I must think of everything I see and experience as being caused by something, and why I can't help but thinking in terms of causality. But it doesn't mean that the things are really caused by something. Maybe that is just me having been born with that concept and having to use it. But maybe in actuality, there are no causal relations between the things. So in this way, the dogmatism, the belief that we deal with things in themselves, necessarily leads to skepticism, as I talked about previously. Now, transcendental idealism, Kant's theory, doesn't have that problem. If I don't believe to deal with the things in themselves, but rather with the appearances of things, then of course it is not possible for them to actually be not the way they appear to me, but in some other way, because there is no actually. Their actual existence, their actual essence, their actual being is being appearances, appearing to me. So now in transcendental idealism, I can say, well, I can be sure that it's not just me having to think of things in terms of causality, but rather things really are connected through causality. Why can I be sure of that? Because if they weren't, I couldn't experience them. The things being connected causally is a condition of the possibility of me being able to experience them. Is a condition of the possibility of them appearing to me at all. So since they are not the things in themselves, but just my representations, just things that appear to me, they must conform to my way of thinking. And that then must not just be me imagining something about them, but rather that really must be their true nature, because their true nature is being my representations, being something that appears to me. So what that means for Kant's answer to the question of physiology is that in terms of where the pure intellectual concepts originate from, he is a rationalist and disagreeing with the empiricists. He is saying they originate in the intellect and not in the senses. But in terms of how we get them, he disagrees with the dogmatic, with the objective rationalists who say we are born with those concepts. And he rather agrees with the empiricists who say we acquire those concepts in the course of our life and in the course of making experiences. And that is exactly what makes Kant a critical or subjective rationalist. So he is saying that we are not getting these concepts out of experience, but we are getting them at the occasion of making experience. So in a temporal sense, we don't have them before making experience. We are not born with them. But we do get them before experience, in the sense of they don't come out of experience. They come out of our own intellect. But how does that work? What does Kant mean by that? Well, let's remember how we get to concepts at all, including empirical concepts. We look at various things. Take the example of the concept of the tree again. We look at various different trees, and we compare these things. We see that there are differences, but that through all their differences, they have something in common. And we abstract from these differences, and these things they have in common, they constitute general rules for us, which make up the concept, like the concept of the tree. Now, this is how we get to all our concepts, be they empirical or be they pure intellectual concepts. It's just that with empirical concepts, we look at objects we find in experience, like the trees, and it is these objects we are comparing. Well, with pure intellectual concepts, the intellect, Kant says, looks at itself, or rather it looks at its own actions, and once again it compares its actions. It finds that these actions are different in certain ways, but they have something in common. And the intellect then abstracts from what's different, reflects on what its own actions have in common, and arrives at a concept of these actions it undertakes. Now, and what are the actions of the intellect? I already talked about that in my previous lecture on apperception. I said that the intellect, according to Kant, is synthesizing. The intellect is giving form. The intellect is a faculty which creates connections. That is basically the only action it does. And that means that in a sense, I will get to that in a moment, but in a sense, we only have one notion, one pure intellectual concept, and that is the concept of connection. All other concepts are empirical in one way or another. If we had no experience, we could not know what a house is, or what a dog is, or what a philosopher is. We only know those things because we made some sort of experience. But we know what a connection is, not because we experienced connections, but because our own intellect, when we are experiencing things, is connecting. It is constantly doing connections. I talked about that in the previous 3 lectures already. There's the apperception, where the intellect connects our representations into one subject, which is conscious of all those representations. There is the apprehension, where the intellect directs the power of imagination to collect and connect all the various sensations into one perception. And there is the intellection and our experience, where the intellect connects our representations that we as subject have with their objects, and through a concept understands the perception it has. It sort of interprets the perceptions. All these actions are actions of connection, and when the intellect reflects on this connecting it does, it arrives at the concept of connection. And I already said in the lecture on apperception that connections are not something we perceive. I gave the example that we don't perceive the leaf of a tree being connected to that tree. Like, okay, we can see that it's right next to the branch, even touching the branch, but all we see is that there's no space in between them that can be seen. But we don't see that they are really part of one whole, that is the tree. I said that if you imagine a person leaning against a wall, you also see that they are right next to each other, even touching, with no space in between. And yet in the one case, you judge that the leaf is part of the tree, and in the other case, you don't judge that the person is part of the wall. So in both cases, you are not seeing a connection as such. You, in the first case, in the case of the leaf and the tree, judge there to be a connection. That is the one concept our intellect has, the concept of connections. And once again, the rationalists are right that this concept comes from the intellect, not from the senses. But the empiricists are right that we are not born knowing what connections are. Like for the newborn baby, the world may be a disconnected chaos, but rather we simply do it. We simply connect, and thereby, after a time, we acquire the concept of connection. I also already said in a previous lecture that this is also Kant's explanation of why we don't remember our very first sensations and perceptions, because we can only really remember connections, and we need to first acquire this concept of connection in the course of our life through connecting again and again. Now, I said that only in a sense do we only have this one notion, this one pure intellectual concept of connection. In fact, Kant will go on to say that there are 12 different categories, he calls them, through which all our thinking is done. And that is because we are not just connecting in general, even though so far that is what I said, but rather there are, according to Kant, 12 ways in which we connect. That is why Kant has a table of judgments, which includes 12 different types of judgments. Because our judgments, he says, are functions of unity. Through each judgment I make, I'm synthesizing some sort of unity. Like when I say Kant is a philosopher, I'm saying there's some sort of unity between Kant and philosopherness. And we have 12 functions of unity, 12 ways of judging things, 12 ways of connecting things. And that means that from them, we can arrive at 12 different concepts. So I will go into this in detail in the next lecture, but to just give an example here, we have what Kant calls problematic judgments. So we can judge that something could be. And that's something that surely even the child does in its first years. Like the child says, there could be one more cookie in the cookie jar. It could be that my dad will come home soon, and that my dad will bring home a present. It could be that if I ask if I get ice cream, I may get ice cream. And so we make these problematic judgments. And if in the course of our life we start reflecting on this sort of judgment, then and comparing these different cases, again, this is how all concepts are created, including the empirical concepts. We compare and we find what's different and what's the same. And here, the child could compare the cases and find that, of course, there are differences. In one case, I'm saying there could be a cookie left. In one case, I'm saying my dad could come home. Those are different things. But it can find also that there's something that these cases have in common. And that is exactly this could. It could be. It is not. I'm not sure of it. and it must not be. I'm not sure that it can't be any other way, but it could be. And if we now reflect on this, then we arrive at the concept of possibility. Possibility is one of our 12 categories in which we think. So that is how we get to our pure intellectual concepts. You could say that the empirical concepts, they unite various representations of objects that we experience into one concept. And you could say that these pure intellectual concepts, these notions, they unite our synthesizing, our various, that is 12 ways of synthesizing representations into concepts. So once again, the rationalists are right that these concepts come from the intellect and not out of experience. But still, the empiricists are also right in a way, because Kant says we only get these concepts through making experience and reflecting on this process, on reflecting on our own intellect's action, reflecting on our own judgments. So experience is not the origin of these concepts, but it is their occasion, so to say. And if we had no experience at all, like if we were beings without any sensuality, just an intellect, then we would never get to these concepts. Our intellect would remain empty and not do anything, because well, what our intellect does, that is that is sort of the core of Kant's whole thinking, and I already addressed it in previous lectures. It only gives form. All the content, all the material needs to come out of the senses. So if there was no material to bring into a form, then the intellect would never start to act, to give forms. And then it could not reflect on the forms it is giving. It is not that there are already complete forms just sort of laying in the intellect, ready to be used and to be applied to the material, but rather when material arrives through the senses, the intellect starts forming it, starts connecting it, and it can then reflect on what it is doing there. It can reflect on the ways in which it is connecting and forming this material, and thereby it can start becoming conscious of the forms it uses. So the forms they are not just ready to be used, they come into being by being used, so to say. And that is Kant's critical or subjective rationalism. That is his answer to the question of the physiology of reason. But of course, his actual question is still the critique of reason, is still what to do with these concepts. Where can they be used and where are their limits? And so in my next lecture, I want to talk about which concepts specifically we have, which pure intellectual concepts, and what we mean. And that means I want to talk about the table of judgments, because as I just explained, the 12 ways in which we make judgments lead us to acquiring these 12 concepts. And then I want to talk about the table of categories. That is, I want to talk about these 12 notions that are the basic pure intellectual concepts of ours. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pei, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklären cause.